Marvellous. Well, hello. Not bad. Hello. There we go. Good. It's good to see you all here. I was chatting with Kylie about how we can best negotiate the fact that there is a post-lunch session. I'm reliably informed that Kylie is a dancer has dancing in her background, and I suggested that maybe I could try that, and she said no, that would be bad. Singing is bad as well. So I give you this quote from Philip Yancey: if God consistently sent lightning bolts in response to bad doctrine, our planet would sparkle nightly like a Christmas tree. So my plan of attack is to be perhaps a little bit provocative and maybe a little bit heretical. Hopefully that will keep you awake. The provocative bit might keep you awake, and then if it fails, then the lightning strike will at least be entertaining for you. Or you might feel a divine sense of justice at that result. Our task for today, for this session, is to consider this question. Is the Australian Church, are our youth ministries and our young adult ministries hemorrhaging faith as well? Is what we've heard this morning just a Canadian thing, just a North American thing, a thing that happens across the Pacific? And as furiously as we both kind of want to be like America and not want to be like the North Americans, is it here as well? I imagine that there might be already kind of three responses or three kinds of people. In fact, I'm almost tempted to do a little bit of a hand aloft survey, which is kind of death in youth ministry, but I'm going to give it a shot with youth workers. Who's been a little... So these are not mutual categories, but who at least has heard something which has been a little bit shocking to them? Like, I didn't know it was that bad. All right. The 70-30 thing caught me a little bit off guard. All right. The 30% blokes, 70% guys and things like that. It's like, oh, yeah, I didn't think it was quite that bad, but maybe. Okay. So there's a bit of shock and awe. Okay. For whom this is, I had a sneaking suspicion, and this is putting numbers and stuff around the sneaking suspicion or the deep sense that I've already had. Quite a few. All right. And is there any who would say, that's just a North American thing, that's not actually my experience here at all? Is there anyone in that instance? I'd kind of like it to be, because then I'm in the wrong spot and we can swap. Okay. All right, so there's a sense where we're feeling like we're on the same page. That's interesting. As I said, so our task today is to consider this kind of question. Is Australia hemorrhaging faith? Oh, I jumped ahead. And my contention is, I'm going to set it out from the front, and then you can decide whether I've won you over or not. I think we are. I reckon there's probably nuances. I cannot point to exactly the same style of research happening here in Australia that could give us a similar picture, but I think there's a lot of similarities going on here. It's obviously going to be nuanced. We might discuss different reasons and so on, and there are obviously huge differences that are taking place. One of the major ones being, particularly for young adults, is that we just don't have the North American thing where you try and move as far away as you can from your parents to go to university. You know, as I've talked to many Year 12ers who've come through Year 12 and into university, they're like, if I can choose a college that produces in 15 minutes, that's going to influence my, talk to Americans like I'm trying to choose something that's 15 states away from home. So we don't always get, it's just a major transition that they have that we don't always have. But nonetheless, some of the sociologists looking at the Australian scene say the kinds of social changes that happen to young people from high school into the first couple of years of post-high school life, whether that's university, jobs, whatever, though the sheer number of changes and the growth and complexity that happens is only equal to a 2-year period that would surround the arrival of a baby. Right? That's just an extraordinary period of change. Just to show you what I mean is that there's probably two classically identified locations where you get what we call switching off or checking out. Switching off is we still come to this thing, but we may as well not be. You've probably seen them. They might be in your Bible studies. Their eyes are just a little bit glazed. They're hoping like anything you don't ask them a question. And the whole experience is doing what we call a giraffe fart, just going straight over their head. Checking out is actually leaving, actually having the courage to go, nah, actually, it was good for you, mum, good for you, dad, or whatever, but it's not for me. Early teen years and late teen years. Let's focus on the early teen years for a second. What is also happening around that juncture? Puberty, all right? Big social change, big biological change, big whole world suddenly appears differently to you. Feelings that you've never experienced before and a whole new bunch of stuff to make sense of, okay? What else is happening there? The big shift from primary school into secondary school, okay? The second big location, you've got the big post-high school move. And so what I want to highlight here is, as we talk about this stuff, faith is faith. It's the spirituality, it's the young person and God, absolutely, but there's always this human social dimension that overlays this. I was in a group when we were talking before about what are some of the things that you're seeing, and one of the comments was, if they bed into relationships before the university, the post-high school transition, if they're bedded into relationships there, that will hold them. The social dimension, right? There is, and we'll explore this further, this social dimension of our faith becomes a big thing. And we're just human beings, wrapped up in flesh. And when big thing changes within our flesh, or around us to the flesh of those whom we care for, big things change in our faith as well. They cause transitions. And so, as divine and sacred as spirituality is, there's something profoundly earthy and embodied to this thing as well. Click. All right. The other contention that I want to make is that you've probably heard it said a million times that, this is an era like no other. There's profound change that's taking place. There's a seismic shift, a perfect storm of stuff. It's highly overused, and so I really hesitate to say this because I feel like I'm treading on ground that's been thoroughly worn out before. But I will mention this, and again, this is the research more from a kind of a sociological side of things, that there is something profoundly different that, yes, postmodernism feeds into it and pluralism and all those kind of other isms that are going on, but it's something also slightly different that's just totally sort of social and structural about just growing up. See, the 1900s and across that century, the 20th century, we really invented teenagerdom, okay? The word almost didn't exist. Adolescence didn't exist much prior to the 1900s, okay? And then suddenly, if we say the word adolescent, we know what we mean. And if someone even in their mid-20s is acting kind of idiotic and stupid, you go, well, just stop being an adolescent and grow up. We kind of know what that means. It means something. Well, it didn't 100 years ago. You couldn't say adolescent and, oh yeah, I know what you mean, right? It's a stage of life that we now understand what kind of people are kind of going through. And so we had 3 stages of life: childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Well, then we seeped this new word into our language, which we call the young adult. And sort of like this person that's on the way and becoming. And that has been around, but here's where the observation comes in. If you go back to the post-war years, some sociologists call it the golden era, because things, all like government policy, internationally and locally, just started to lock in and go, we are going to create a stable world, a stable developmental pathway, a stable way for everyone to become adults and enjoy the fullness that the West has to offer. And in terms of these markers of adulthood, the majority of people completed their education, landed for the rest of their life, like done, finished, landed in a job that could probably see out the rest of their days until they got their golden cuckoo clock at the end, were married, started a family, and were probably living in residential and relative financial independence from their family. That was the majority experience by the mid-20s. Right? Something like 80% had hit it by 27, something like 2/3 of people by 23, 24, within the 1960s and even up into the 1970s. So it was the majority experience to have this done and settled by the time you're 23, 24, 25. Is anyone giggling at this point? Yeah, right? For how many people would this be done by 23, 24, 25? If you know them, then they are the exception now. And the majority is the total opposite. All right? We don't finish education, ever. All right? We've coined nasty words like adolescence instead of adolescence to say these kids that hang around forever and ever, and if they could just go away, and we kind of need to financially bail them out well into their 20s, and why am I still paying a mobile phone bill? And that these things just aren't happening. And so where before that second paragraph, becoming an adult was a matter of following a tripart life course that resembled a veritable march through the institutions of marriage, parenthood and work, is achievable for the masses, but now it doesn't happen. Very rarely. And as people have stared into this fact, they're really saying there's a whole new period in the life course. It's no longer childhood, adolescence, and ta-da, you're an adult. Because if you call someone in their mid-20s trying to navigate these transitions and adolescent, they'll not be very happy with you. All right. That there's this emerging into adult that happens. And so young adulthood is when you're doing the adult thing in young ways, like doing the marriage and family in particular. But now there's this whole era where from post-high school years up into the mid-20s, the world is literally your oyster. And courtesy of all of our technologies and internet and all the rest of it, the world, anything's possible. At least you think anything's possible. And when anything's possible and you could do anything, boy, do you have choice anxiety. And it's never been so hard to fill out your VTAC. What do I want to actually study to become what I want to be when I could be anything? And so these transitions are thoroughly being delayed, sometimes for as long as possible. As long as possible. Now, if these transitions are being delayed as possible and making adult commitments as being delayed as possible, then there's a whole new era in the life course. I don't know what it's going to be called, but I have a feeling that as much as we know that adolescence is a thing that has its own challenges, and we now call this young youth ministry and all that kind of stuff, I think the post-high school years are going to become a thing. Now, in academic land, they call it emerging adulthood, which is a big problem because all across the churches, we've been putting young adult ministry on the doors. So we're going to have to change all our signs if we're going to keep up with academia. But there's this whole age and stage that's there now. It's locked in. One of the guys who's the key guy in this area, Jeffrey Jensen Arnett, says it's a new, historically unprecedented period of the life course, and so it requires a new term, a new way of thinking. I call it emerging adulthood. He's the guy that coined the term back in the 2000s, and it's been consolidating ever since. And so just as there's a checkout period from childhood into adolescence, from Sunday school into youth ministry, and we've developed this science of youth ministry now for about 40 or 50 years, it's become its own thing. There's this massive checkout zone as well in the post-high school years. And I think young adulthood and young adult ministry or emerging adult ministry, or call it what you will, is going to need its own science and its new way, because our current strategy at the moment is either make youth ministry more complex, and we'll call it young adulthood, or they're your leaders for your youth ministry. But what ministry is to young adults needs to be more than those who prop up your youth ministry. Just kick off with the light little Nostradamus moment. Okay. That's it there. So our target, 2:20. That's a long introduction. Speed up. All right. So in the next 10 minutes, my proposal is to spend 20 minutes on looking at the Australian research. They were the things that I just thought to include this morning. So now we're up to the bit where, okay, speed up. So my task is we're going to walk around some of the research that's been generated out of Australia to ask this question: is Australian youth ministry hemorrhaging faith? Is the Australian church's hemorrhaging faith? I'm going to walk you around, and I'm really just going to throw some arrows in different directions. I've tried to put full references up there. You're absolutely welcome to email me and I can send you this stuff. So anything that's up here, don't furiously write it down unless it's just absolutely amazing and you want to write it down. Just email me and I can send you this. It's fine. But I just want to point to you the research that has been happening in Australia. That's part one. And then part two, I'm going to ask you to think pretty hard, because a big question for us is, even if we agree whole in part with what might be going on in Australia from a research level, we have this question of where, and I'm not straying into the answers yet, but how do we interpret the data? Okay, and there's two sides to that, because data is never neutral. You've probably heard it said 95% of statistics are used to say whatever we want, right? Okay, and that's partly because data itself needs to be interpreted, but the questions that first gave rise to that data also came from a perspective as well. A question gets phrased a particular way. If you look at the Haemorrhaging Faith report, they asked about heaven and hell. Now, on the one hand, you might interpret that to say, well, how orthodox are these people? Do they still believe in heaven and hell? Well, I've got to say that like a third of the academic Christian community, that question's right out to lunch for them at the moment. It's not necessarily a litmus test of orthodoxy anymore, but if you read carefully their report, they've been very careful with it as well, because for them what they're actually searching for is how a young person engages with authority structures and the notion of judgment and judgmentalism, which is, in postmodern world is not cool, okay? So what lenses we bring to the data, why, the questions that we ask generate the data that we're given, and then we need to interpret them as well. So we're going to look at some questions around that. I'm obviously not singing and dancing enough because you're looking like you're fading already. All right, get on with it. So the short answer is there anything like Haemorrhaging Faith research in Australia? The answer is no. We haven't had a collective body who've actively gone after this question and tried to, as thoroughly and as richly as the guys in Canada have done, produced what they have. In that sense, what Haemorrhaging Faith is a tremendous gift to the Christian community, and something I think we can be grateful for and get as much out of as we can. There has been a major youth research project with Phil, who we'll hear from later, was one of the key drivers. It got called different things, so I'm going to refer to it as the Australian Youth Spirituality Survey, which then produced a couple of different books. Phil's there, Putting Life Together, and also The Spirit of Generation Y, which Mike Mason and others are involved in. I think you'll find Phil's book on the table out there with other CRA stuff. I'll talk about some more research that Phil's been doing, because my humble opinion, Phil is a tremendous resource to youth ministry and research in Australia, and I'd like to pay homage to that fact. This research attempted to get the sense, the spirit, the vibe, the culture of what's happening within youth and their spirituality and their faith expression. So in that sense, there's, to my awareness, there's no key metrics about were you in and then you became out, and so the kind of stuff that Haemorrhaging was particularly looking after. But if you want a sense of what is in the quagmire of a young person and their spirituality, then these books are tremendous resources for you. However, there is a story in Australia that has focused on this question of what's happening with our young people and what is their engagement with the church. And believe it or not, it started back in the 70s in South Australia with this book. So John Boddicombe is now residing in Melbourne. And I didn't know this at the time, but this research project was supervised by the person who's now my PhD supervisor. I found that like a year out down the track. I was like, oh, that's handy, that's good. But John was specifically commissioned by a collective of churches, hear the echoes of this. He was specifically commissioned by a collective of churches in South Australia to investigate the question, why are young adults leaving the church? Young adults at the time, okay? Back in the 70s. So many of the churches that became the Uniting Church were involved, as well as the Churches of Christ. I'm just looking at the date. This is published in 1976. Okay? And what's best about this research is it produced a very thin book. Very accessible. And it's a quick read, and you can borrow it from the Dalton McCoffney Library, except I have the current copy, so you'll have to fight me for it. But just some of the highlights. On average, if you kind of average it out, 17 was when young people were considered to be most involved in their church. If you were looking for a singular age, and you can see it falling off a cliff after that. If you space that out a little bit, it's a much smaller sampler group. They did in-depth interviews with about 30 people who were specifically identified as being post-church in their relationship. So that's ages across the top, and you can see that some people were pretty much born in the church but then finished up around 19. The next cohort finished up around 24. But 19, you can see, is that age when they began reducing or ceasing their involvement. You can see that in the 70s, this kind of mid-teen conversion into the church was a very low experience. It was also the era of the birth of parachurch stuff. okay, through this era, and it was the tail end of the Sunday school movement as well. Here's a different way of looking at it. They were asked, when were you most active, when you were most into it? And the answer is 15 to 22. And outside of those ranges, it was you're just getting conscious, and then at 22 you were conscious and you're on the way out by that stage. Their figure was about 70% as well of people coming through those churches in South Australia would be gone by the time they were 22 to 24, I think. Very particular context. You need to read it on the tail end of the massive amount of stuff that was happening in the Sunday school movement that was just really coming to an end through that era. But really interesting that in Australia, this story, this question of what's going on with our young people and why isn't our churches navigating this difference started in the 70s, right? 50 years ago. 50 years ago, this question became live to us. What was really interesting, and you might have heard some young adults say this themselves, is some of them even took affront to the idea that they were considered a church dropout, and it wasn't uncommon to hear, I haven't left the church, it's just that I haven't been going for 3 years. And we giggle at that, but there's some sense where, and this has really become quite central to some of the research that I've carried on with, is what they do is a very important marker for how they're travelling in their faith, but it's not everything. There's something going on at an identity level and at an affiliation level which is sort of different to what sometimes their behaviour might track. And so for some of these people, they're like, I still feel like it's a part of me. At some identity level, it still has a hold on me, but it's certainly not been part of my active expression for a while. Something we'll explore. The other thing that was interesting is in the most common journey that they experienced was one of just fading out, okay, which has been a book not too long ago as well by the same crew behind Orange, looking at how the fade out transpires. What was the name of that book? Slow Fade, thank you, Slow Fade. Now in Australia, this trajectory continues really through the NCLS work, and Peter Caldor in '87 was one of the earliest things that I can find who started to draw our attention to the fact that they're going. Now he's a statistician, and the National Church Life people are statisticians, so the way they say this is that young people started to become underrepresented in the church, which, if I can translate for you, that's a statistician's way of saying, there's a problem, people! Wake up! But they rarely shout, so you don't often hear them. We let the numbers talk for us. Pardon? I don't understand numbers. Yes. So people need to shout for them. But since '87, this story has been happening in the churches. Okay. But again, it slips through or something like that. The way it looks like is this. So there was a sociologist called Moll, who it's an estimation. So this is a depiction of what he researched as an estimation. So don't go dot point for dot point on my actual picture. I'm using this as a diagram to represent what was going on. This is the Australian population profile as at 1966. Okay, can this point and shoot at things? Is that what red does? Yes. Woohoo! All right, there you go. So these people here became what we know as the baby boomers. All right, and we've got something representing kind of the pyramid shape. All right. We've got they call these the silent years or the depression kind of, but that's a bit reduced kind of birth rate. And Moll, who did he's a sociologist of religion in Australia, estimated that roughly speaking, the demographic profile of the Australian church matched the demographic profile of Australia. More or less, each age group was represented. More or less. Okay? Now, we can use the NCLS data with the ABS to then go, well, what's happening in Australia today? So this is the profile of Australia today from age 15 and upwards. So the baby boomers are up around here now, okay? And when you overlay the Australian church, that's what we mean by underrepresented, okay? That's that, we have a problem here, people, all right? Now, I was talking about this with a denominational rep once who said, it's just the life course pattern, all right? They're kind of not as underrepresented below here as kids because they have to come because their parents bring them along, but then they get a choice. And I think the phrase sowing their wild oats was also used in the conversation, that they go and do their crazy stuff and they go and see if their parents and their youth pastors were lying to them about the big bad world. And then they have kids and find out that they were right and they come back and so on. And so it's just a picture of the life course and the way people grow up. But the conclusion of the NCLS is, well, no. Because what we've seen happening is an increasing depression or an increasing underrepresentation at the younger years, getting worse and worse and worse, decade upon decade, and then this billowing out of the aged population at the top to compensate, because we're dealing with percentages. They worded it like this, which is a long paragraph. I'll start from the second. 40 years later, there is a large gap between the age profile of the Australian community and the church attenders, 2006, as it says when this report came out. It was the young who first started to leave the churches in the 60s and 70s. They have not returned. Now younger generations are absent from the churches in greater numbers. Skip down a paragraph. However, it has been argued that a unique set of social and cultural changes during the 60s impacted the baby boom cohort as they entered young adulthood. They defected in large numbers from the churches and most did not return. Their final comment, many churches missed that moment and never caught up. Have a guess what my encouragement is. Don't be the lesson from history that you never learned from history. Okay? We've had this song being sung for more than 50 years now. Something's going on and we're not winning. Now, these are snapshots over time. NCLS is kind of longitudinal, if you like. There's the American data, which you may or may not have been aware of. So in America, their estimation is that, Rethink Study, which is a survey of surveys, looked at 58 to 84% of young people previously active left the church as young adults. You Lost Me, which has got a lot of statistical grunt behind it with the Barna research, reckon that 6 out of 10 young people, 20 or over, who were once involved in the church failed to carry on their faith into early adulthood. This study here is a ripper. So Christian Smith and the National Survey of Youth and Religion, NSYR, you can look it up. They've got longitudinal data which has followed a cohort of 300 Americans that are representative of at least the United States. The initial cohort was from 12 to 17 and they went back to them every 3 years, 4 times. So they've got longitudinal data that runs from 12 through to 28-year-olds. On their faith journeys, bolstered by then each time they do a data collection, they usually do a 1,000 to 3,000 person phone survey as well. So the last cut they've done, but they haven't released the data on that yet, but Christian Smith, who is the key driver of this, has become really focused on emerging adult and spirituality and is producing some fabulous stuff. Just to explain this table here, they developed this scale of minimally developed religiosity and church engagement, a partially developed, a moderately developed, and a highly developed or mature religious engagement. So just kind of a scale of engagement, if you like. And then what they did was, so initially they could divide teenagers as being 11% minimally developed, 25% 30 and 34% highly developed. When they went back 6 years later, so they went 3 and then 6 and got to those same people, they found that half of our highly developed people had dropped to a lower category, and that half of the moderately developed had dropped to a lower category, and then a third of the partially developed had dropped to a lower category, and the minimally didn't drop because you can't get any lower. Okay, so the overwhelming movement into emerging in young adult years was this decline. Okay, in fact, when they really started to crunch their numbers on it, and they didn't do a cluster analysis like the Haemorrhaging Faith did, they did another form which I can't remember the name of, but it allows them to track movements over time of collected groups. And they became really interested in this because it not only highlighted that there is a movement upwards. Right, so a third either stay high in their involvement or only 3.6% actually grow in their faith and maturity across these years. All right, but there's your decline. Okay, down, down, down. About 57% are low or declining across these years. And this was the chilling thing that I heard Christian Smith talk about. He said the thing about it was the people here, even in this group here, up until about 18 or 19, could still be your best youth leader at the surface of it. They could still be leading Bible studies, they could still be active on your camps, they could still be rocking up. They might pray 3 times a week, at small group, at youth group, and at church. All right? But one morning they wake up and they go, I just figured something out. I don't believe a word of this anymore. And they're gone. And the thing is, you look at it and you go, what just happened? How did they go from nah to whoa so quickly? And he says, as far as we can tell from our data, it's been coming for a long time. You've just been looking at the wrong things. Okay? And that's a question I'll return to as we consider the hemorrhaging faith data. Is it's really important stuff, but what lenses do we bring to it? Because we could wrap a lot of stuff around that data that allows us to clothe ourselves in glory that overstates it. But we need to look carefully at what this might represent. All right, I just want to skip a few. So the only other thing that we've really got to peg a number on how many people are leaving are what we call retrospective surveys. So where you ask someone at age X what they remember was their involvement at different periods of time. Retrospective, it's okay, it's a proxy, it's not deadly accurate. You've got to remember whenever you do these kind of retrospective questions that whoever is describing them to you is saying, my memory through my lens at now, looking back, is X, and there's a lot of changes that happen over the years, okay? But when we do that, the Spirit of Generation Y tried to do this a little bit. They didn't peg a number on it, but they just said our research reveals quite dramatic losses of young members from various churches, while large increases in the no religion identification leaves no doubt as to the destination of the exits. They said that from our estimation of the data, they're going. Again, Phil's been working at this, and in his most recent pointers, which is available out there as well, he's been looking at a variety of international and national social attitudes surveys. And there's a series of questions in there, and one of them that asks, were you active at 11 years of age? Are you still active now? Here are the numbers. You ready? So just for 15 to 19-year-olds in the US, about half were active at 11, and at 15 to 29 years age are no longer active. So half gone. There's the halfway mark, all right? In the UK, similarly, and in Australia, we win. Or lose, depending on how you look at it. When you average it out across all ages, US is doing the best, if you like, UK is struggling, and Australia is doing an awesome job. Another thing that Phil's contributed is this sense of the missing 500,000, and please tell me if I'm badly paraphrasing you or getting this completely wrong, Phil, but my understanding of it was we've had 3 census, 2001, 6 and 11. In 2001, we had X number of people who the box was ticked by their parents to say, yep, me and my kids identify as Christians, but as they then came online to fill in their own census survey, 500,000 by 2011 had ticked no religion. Do the numbers and you get 50,000 people a year starting to fall away within Australia. Is that a correct interpretation? Close enough, you can correct me in the next hour. Okay. All right, that's... So, Australian situation. I think we're right there. We might even be leading the charge on the hemorrhaging faith thing. Now, I realise that then this impacts our experience quite differently, which is to say that one of the things I think I have seen happening in Australia, and this is only anecdotal, I think we've had really profound shifts in what we call demographic consolidation in churches, which is to say that in America, I cannot verify the statistics, so I hesitate to say it, but there's something like the 80-20 rule starting to kick in, which is that 80% of Christians in America are now located in 20% of churches, and roughly speaking, there are about 750 people or more in those churches. So we're starting to clump together into these larger churches, and the smaller churches are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. It's kind of, we call it the Bunnings effect, all right? The hardware store in the shadow of Bunnings has just got no hope, okay? And in youth ministry, we're seeing the same kind of thing, and particularly with the young adults who are now mobile and they've got their own licenses and they don't need their parents to drop them off, are consolidating into young adult churches, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if 80% of our young adults who are still holding on the faith are located in probably less than 20% of churches, right? And so we're getting these demographically elongated churches which are responding really well to young adults. But then I guess it'll be a question for our panel, it also then creates their own problems. So one of the big discoveries over the last 10 to 20 years, you'll hear about intergenerational ministry. Okay, one of the huge faith effect things we've heard about, the parents thing already today, and that more broadly that intergenerational connections is one of the strongest predictors of faith. In fact, Cara Powell, who's in the Sticky Faith movement, was asked, just give me one thing that I need to do as a youth minister that will make the biggest difference in my youth ministry. She said, if I arrived at a church and I could do only one thing and I was starting from scratch, I wouldn't do a Friday night thing, I wouldn't do entertainment, I wouldn't do this, I wouldn't do that. I would start anything that I could that created intergenerational connections, because I know statistically they are the one thing that actually make a difference. They may not do evangelism so well, but in terms of faith development, there's just nothing like having a grandma sticking by you all the way through the crazy transitions that you'll do. I'm going to want to skip a few here. Some really interesting Aussie stuff that's come out just recently. So just across the ditch, embedded faith. Jason, where are you? Goronsky. Still at lunch. I think this is Jason's student. So this is from New Zealand, and it's the actual faith journeys of emerging and young adults in the churches who stayed. Why are you still here? What's going on? Tell me about your connection with worship, with preaching, with gathered community, with someone. I haven't got very far with this book, but I'm really looking forward to it, because it's not the why have they left, it's why have those who stayed, and what made the difference in their crunch moments that actually made the difference. Another Aussie book then is David Godwin's. This is looking at the younger crew. So remember the first checkout drop-off point. He's really looking at that era with this one, Lost in Transition or Not, addressing the younger generation. And then another enormous body of research, which is probably going to pass us by in evangelical world, is Barry Game and the Value Genesis study, because that's come out of the SDA, so the Sevies. So the Seventh-day Adventists internationally in 1990 surveyed 13,000 students in all SDA schools around the world about their spirituality and about their faith, and then went back again in 2000 and got 18,000 of them to do it. So they're starting to get longitudinal stuff as well. They've done 2 rounds of it in Australia, the most recent in 2012 that had 3,000 students in it. About half came from active SDA families and about half were just kids in SDA schools. But Barry's written a fair bit of stuff, and he's got quite interesting thoughts and conclusions as to what he's seeing out of that. So I just want to highlight there's interesting pockets of research happening all around Australia. 15 minutes left, that's a pain. All right, so that's the Australian context. I said, I reckon it's happening here. I realise it's not as sharp and as polished as the hemorrhaging faith stuff, but if there's enough things that kind of look like a koala, you just kind of have to assume it's a koala. There's enough things going on here to say there's a great big challenge for how we do things around here. All right, now this is the bit where I might get a bit provocative, and in 15 minutes I'm going to have to be short and sharp about it. The question becomes, how do we appropriate this and how do we interpret this? So I'm going to ask some questions about what lenses are we bringing to the data. Now in doing this, I don't want you to hear me as saying either that the guys at Haemorrhaging Faith have got it wrong, because I'm not interpreting it for them and I'm not arguing with them. But I realised that I read this about 2 years ago when I went and visited some old friends in Canada, and they said, have you seen this? And that was my introduction into the world. And I can remember what I first thought when I read this compared to now that I've really sat with it for a while and thought, and recognise the lenses that I initially brought to it to the ones that I now bring to it. And so I just want to explore this with you. Now I'm going to do it by pushing a particular angle, which may or may not be common for you and may be a bit foreign for you and might be a bit heretical for you, but I want to do that so that if you are feeling like this is all going wrong and pear-shaped, you're resisting what's going on or what I'm presenting, then I need you to loop around and go, why is that the case? Okay, why do I hold a different opinion about this? Now, I set this up to be really sounding provocative, but maybe it's not that much for you, I don't know. So I'm just over-promising and under-delivering, which Dave told not to do, sorry. So I want to focus on these 4 spiritual types they get called in the report. It's a typology, if you like: the engaged, the fence-sitters, the wanderers, and the rejectors. And the main thing that I want to start to shoot at here is that it really feels like these guys are home and hosed, right? And that these guys we're worried about, and that these guys are kind of furthest from the kingdom, all right? And so it kind of becomes how far damned are they? Spectrum. Now, when you look at the data and the report, I don't know if the report's freely available, it's certainly you can buy it for $15 and just download the PDF. Now, I don't want you to look at the substance of these, but what I want you to see is on the far left, every time you see a bar graph, the far left is the engagers, and then you get the fence sitters, the wanderers, and the rejectors, okay? And just look at the colour, if you can, that you really get, so there's the engagers, 85% going well, and then it just falls through the floor with the fence sitters, the wanderers, and the rejectors, okay? And again, and then it goes the opposite way, almost none in the engagers, but then it's all there in the fence sitters and onwards, and again, and again. All right, that you really get this situation of there's the 1 and the 3 in this data. That there's the engaged, which seem to be going okay, but then everyone else at the data level is highly problematic. And the first question I have for your lens is, what words would you give to folks? You might engage a young adult, you might have these 4 categories, you might even remember the names of these 4 categories based on today. You might even be thinking of faces now running through your minds going, oh, yeah, I'd probably think that they were a fence sitter. And then the question is, well, what words would you use around them? Are the engaged saved? Are they the Christian ones? Are the others post-Christian, prodigals, backsliders, lost? Have they lost their salvation? Are we going to have to baptise them again? Ooh, I won't go there. What lens do we bring to this? To depict it another way, are the engagers the ones that are close and everyone else progressively further and further away from the cross? Question number 1, we will explore it. Question number 1, oh dear, 10 minutes. Question number 2 is, then what do we do when it comes to our ministry? For those of us who focused on church-based ministry, do we need to set up our discipleship and ministry programs with the pure target of making engaged people? And then we know we've failed if we wind up producing fence sitters, wanderers, and rejectors. Are they the evidence that what we're doing here is not working? What lens do we bring to these things? I think in Christian land we have sometimes too simplistic metaphors. Too simplistic. That's not two double O. Metaphors that are overly simplistic. Thank you, Kim. There we go. All right, do you recognise this image? Apart from the text on the side. Okay, Rembrandt, The Return of the Prodigal. Okay, and in thinking through the prodigal metaphor, it's a common metaphor that we have that, in fact, I was talking to a parents just on Sunday, invited beautifully around to their lunch, and I could hear the grief in their voice and I could see it in their eyes, and they used the language of, I have a prodigal. I have a kid who was born and raised, and I thought I established within them a firm foundation, and I know that they've made their own choices, and I'm not beating myself up, but I have grief about the fact that they've wandered to a foreign land. Right, and if you work with the imagery within the parable and within the kind of the cultural context, where you've got large amounts of, the young son bringing shame upon the family and disreputing not only the father, but the whole village in which he was and the whole tradition in which he was raised by going to a Gentile nation, and finally ending up like in the lowest of low positions that Jesus could describe for a Pharisaic audience, eating alongside the same food as unclean animals, supporting an economy of which the Jewish people wanted nothing to do with. They're the lost ones. They're our prodigals, and we hope, like anything, that they come home. Is that what the fence sitters and the wanderers and the rejectors are? Are they our prodigals? Have they gone to a foreign land? Are they dining with pigs? Are they this 60 to 80% who've lost or rejected their faith? Is that the best metaphor that we can bring to this? Well, my question for you is, as you listen to that story, or if you think through the mind of the parable of the prodigal son, were there any other prodigals in that story? There's a really big question for me there about who is actually the prodigal in this story. And partly we're given a clue if we go back some verses before the lost coin, before the lost sheep, to hear who is the audience here. Now tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus, and who else was there? The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who seemed to be muttering, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And this is the thing that Luke says, and now listen to the stories. Jesus' stories were not generic teaching to the tax collectors and the sinners, but because of the rumblings of the Pharisees. And if you look in Rembrandt's picture, we have an older son who looks nothing like this guy and looks a lot like a teacher of the law. And you get this kind of move that says, so who's the prodigal? And if you look at the monologue that the older son delivers to the dad, you're left in no doubt that one son geographically left, but the other son, even though he was home and responsible and being a good youth leader, was a million miles from home. A long way. And can I skip that? Yeah. Is that going to stop? Or am I creating great issues for you? There's a 2-minute video. Oh, thank you. Well done. So here's the question. Who's furthest from the kingdom? And does this data actually give us enough information to even know? And I know that we don't get to make a call on whose salvation is what, but we inevitably deal with these kinds of categories when we talk about people being close or people being far away. Now, we've already heard the comment this morning that it's actually sometimes the rejectors which seem, I think the language used, closer. All right? And that video that you had is actually, if you're hemorrhaging faith and look it up on YouTube, you'll see a 4-part interview with Dave and a few others. And one of the stories of one of the young adult ministers who was there, she goes, "This is my story. I was a rejecter. I grew up, went through a horrendous split. I was gone for 4 or 5 years, and then I moved. I had a transition. Now, transitions are usually bad for your faith, and it was bad for her atheistic faith because she felt really lonely and she remembered the connectedness she experienced in church and went back to church. She now pastors there. She went from rejecter to youth pastor in shorter than 6 years. Young adults pastor at that same church in shorter than 6 years. How far were they from the kingdom? You see, I think you probably know, and you can probably list off the number of stories where whatever was the actual recipe going on inside a person that looked to you initially like absolute overt angst to the gospel suddenly comes tumbling down and they're repentant so quickly. All right. What are we looking for? What lenses do we bring to this? Let me give you one lens to bring to it. It's the lens of faith development. Not just James Fowler, he's kind of the icon of the person who's developed this stuff. Who's familiar with faith development theory? Give me a big nod if you've got no idea what I'm talking about. It's really helpful. Come on, just admit it. Okay, all right. If I can synthesize it really roughly for you, and this is really roughly, it's not just James Fowler. There's a bunch of other guys that have been thinking about how faith grows up. And they disagree in all sorts of ways, but what's kind of interesting, when you stick it all together, there's actually a strong common expression or picture that they begin to develop, which looks a little bit like this, that they understand that there's an aspect of faith which is just profoundly pre-conscious and experiential. There are times when God just does go zap, all right, and everything else recedes away, and it's just you and him. And for some people that don't have the Christian experience, but then have a God moment, they're left wondering, well, how do I make sense of that? All right. Or you might hear it like this: my life was falling apart, and then I met X, Sally, whoever, and I wanted what she's got. You see that experience? I don't know what it was. So I followed her too, and then comes the social dimension, youth group, church, or whatever, and I became a part of other people who shared that same common expression, and they helped me to make sense of my experiences that had come to life. And usually those two things are enough to bring someone to faith. And a lot of these faith development surveys highlighted that many people who remain in the church do so with just these two aspects going on. Significant experiences of God backed up by social engagements with it, and they stay in the church as long as that holds. In fact, I can point you to 60-year-olds who I'm fairly sure that is true, and it's held them tight even through triple bypasses and partial paralysis of their body, because the community rallied around them and gave them freezer meals and visited them in hospital, and as long as that held, the whole lot held. Okay? But there are some people that life doesn't allow them to be held in that environment, and they go searching. New authority figures come in, different ideas of truth, pluralism takes its way, or those moments that particularly wound up in rejectors' lives, divorces, parents no longer going, death in the family, this, that, or whatever, and it forces them into a searching motif. But what's so important about faith development theory is that the thing about the red zone, as I call it, it's not losing faith. It's an integral part of faith moving towards a more integrated stage. The research on people in the red zone, they feel misunderstood, they feel lonely and isolated, they feel persecuted by the mainstream, they're wildly confused, and of course they would feel hypocritical if they rocked up to church. And as I concur with what Dave said, it's a little bit of them and it's a little bit of us. But the thing is that this lens highlights that you don't get to integrated faith without going through the red zone in really significant ways. You don't get to own something as your own faith until you arrest it from those around you and say, is this really true for me? Really? Really? Or a way of thinking it is that we start with faith, we move into a searching stage, and then you've got three options. One is you can reaffirm and reappropriate the faith that you have once held, the faith that you once held. You might reject your faith in Christ and your participation in the church, but that takes a fair while to do, to actually disidentify with everything that has been given to you. But there's a third category which I want to offer, and this is one that I don't see readily in the research, and I'll finish up on this point. I meet a lot of people who actually re-envision their faith in Christ and participation in the church. And what I mean by that is that they go through these periods and they wrestle it out and they finally come to the conclusion of, yes, I'm still a Christian, but not in the way that I was. And I'm not like you or you. And they slip away from the church. They engage in very alternative forms of church sometimes. They'll often cluster together in new forms and expressions of church, and the mainstream kind of go, tut, 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 they won't last very long anyway. All right. But the point is they wind up with a reappropriation of faith, which kind of puts them a little bit at loggerhead, either with the mainstream, but particularly with the faith of their origins. And that in my own research has led me to conclude that actually the relationship between the faith of origins and what results from going through these periods of searching is really critical. If they've been given a faith in their origins that is spacious, open to inquiry, willing to converse and journey in very personal ways as they go through these times, they often go really well. If they've been given a very tight, boxed up version of faith, which goes, this is the gospel, this is the faith, we are the wanderers of God and everybody else isn't, then when they reappropriate their faith, they're left with the question, am I still Christian? To which the answer that they've been given is, you can't play with us. You're outside the box. And so, a little bit of them and a little bit of us. Sometimes our really clear intent to keep people safe from the wiles out there can wildly backfire with people as they make their way through. I need to conclude. I'd really like to do another 2 minutes, but I won't. Do I have to? I don't. 2? All right. Confession. 1, 2, skip a few. So, I really want to nail this down into ministry context, okay? So 2 minutes ago is like this. When I first started out in youth pastoring, I was a wildly introverted person and still probably am. I can just pretend a little bit better now. And I looked at it, and I'm going to use really round numbers, okay? So let's just say my church had 100 families that had people of kind of a teenage years. They didn't have that much, but it felt like it. I went, right, there's me and there's 100 kids I could possibly minister to, and that's just inside the kids, let alone the school down the road and all that kind of stuff. I can't even remember 100 names. I'm stuffed. I need help around here. 12's a holy number. I need 12 youth leaders to help me. And they need to be responsible and mature and have got their holiness ethic, and they've kind of got it all together so that I can pour my life into these 12, that sounds biblical, right? And they can pour their life into 3 or 4 others, into little life groups and this and that will create the active youth members of our congregation. Yeah? right? And it's discipleship, and it's what do you notice about the shape of that? Yeah. I just built structural attrition into my youth ministry. The only way to grow up in faith was to grow in towards youth leadership. And because I was employed 3 days a week, and I was an introvert, so I was maxed out with all the relationships I could handle, my whole lot, and because all youth ministers are like overworked and underpaid and there's not enough time and churches don't have enough money, all your time is spent with the system that you create. And I was taxed totally with the system that I created. And if the statistics were true of my ministry, which I'm sure they were, all right, then there's a whole group that were senior youth, young adults who weren't suited to leadership, but I had no time for them. I had no ministry for them because I don't have any ministry practices at this point in time that journeys with people through the red zone. I only had ministry for people that were in the green and the blue zone. Experience and socialisation, that's what I could do. But you hit the red zone, I've got nothing for you. All right? I just get to call you and go, hey, noticed you haven't been coming to youth lately. Come back to the green zone. All right? Notice you haven't been around much. Come back to the green zone. Then I can minister to you. But actually going to you in the red zone, I had nothing. I could play with engages, but I don't know what ministry actually looks like. And I now have the lens which says, I reckon all of those, by and large, are still actively engaged in faithing in some way, shape or form. So if you're a senior minister, this is my call to you. The next time you get to write up the position description of your youth minister, have a think about this. If they're charged with the youth of your church, that needs to be 1/3 of their PD. You need to give them 1/3 of their time available to think very differently about this crew, and then free them up for 1/3 in mission. If that's too much for them, then hire 3 people. And don't go with internships where that's slave labour. That was the provocative bit. Okay. I'm going to end with this question. Haemorrhaging Faith, right towards the end, page 108, says, an important follow-up study could examine why faith of some is strengthened by hardship while the faith of others is weakened. Welcome to my PhD. Don't have the answer yet. Don't know if I ever will, but this is where my hint is going. Number one is that formation networks are going to be really important for young people. That when we think about youth ministry, we need to not think of it as a parachurch thing that they come to, but all of our youth ministry exists to help young people with their gathered community and their worshipping community, with their own practices of faith, with their mentors who accompany them, with their spiritual friendships that actually have spirituality within it, and with their missional engagement. And then you as a youth minister can happily bow out and go, you'll be fine. You'll be just fine. And if you can think about how your practices and missions and programs help to be nurtured in young people before they hit the university years, the post-high school years, they'll be rocking. Secondly, I think we need to think not so much in terms of these salvific overtones, but in terms of identity. And I'm not going to explain that because that's just a mess. But the point of it is that you know that we might say these people are so far away and then suddenly they're so close. I think we need a different set of eyes to think about how people are really travelling with their spirituality, and it has a lot to do with this identity question more than their behaviour question. Even beyond their questioning, it's actually this identity question, which there's a lot of ways to consider that. And then third of all, my biggest measure of whether someone's a worry for me is their level of apathy. All right? If apathy is low, spirituality is really low for them. All right, but you take a rejecter, they've got angst. There's something to play with. But you get someone with apathy and Jesus could rock up in front of them, and if they go, nah, all right, now you've got a real worry. Okay? So, an examination, or come up, arrest this thing away from me. This is my encouragement to, I think there's a lot of richness in this report. I'd love you to dive into it for yourselves, and then even beyond that, to consider this question: what lenses am I bringing to this? Where do I see these people, and can I learn to see faith even in people that I might call a wanderer, a fence sitter, or a rejecter?
Thank you, Rowan.